one of my favorite accounts in Scripture is this mentorship that we see play out between Paul and Timothy. And I'm going to kind of chat about these guys over the next couple of podcasts. I'm not quite sure where it's all going to go, but we're going to start it here today. And I want to start in 1 Timothy chapter 4, where Paul is actually giving instructions to Timothy. And I'm going to kind of pull a couple of different scriptures out here. But he's giving specific instructions to Timothy. And at one point in verse 7, he talks about, train yourself to be godly. And he talks about, hey, physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, right? And then it goes on a little bit, and he talks to them. He's writing to Timothy and saying, command and teach these things. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers. And he gives them in a couple areas here. He says, set an example for the believers in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and in purity. Until I come, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to teaching, to preaching. Do not neglect your gift, Timothy, which was given you through a prophetic message when the body of elders laid their hands on you. And he goes on to say in verse 15, be diligent in these matters. Give yourself wholly to them so that everyone may see your progress. Watch your life and your doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. So why do I bring this up? I think this is one of the most impactful lessons that we can learn about mentorship from both the mentor and protege standpoint here. But we see Paul is saying to Timothy, listen, number one, as your mentor, I want to encourage you and challenge you to train yourself to be godly. And that is for both now and for eternity. There's benefits for the now in doing that, and then there's certainly benefits for eternity in life. But train yourself to be godly. So mentors, we can't encourage proteges to train themselves to be godly if we ourselves are not training ourselves to be godly. And number two, what I love about the practical side of all of this is Paul is encouraging Timothy to be an example. He's saying, listen, set an example here in your speech and in your life and your love and your faith and your purity. And so you want to talk about, well, I don't know, Garret, what do I do in mentorship? What do I do as a mentor? Well, number one, we can encourage another man to train himself to be godly. And if we're doing that, we too, as the mentor, must do that. And we see Paul do that, right? We know that Paul is consistently and constantly training himself to be more like Christ. And then we get to the practical piece of that is to say, well, hey, let's start talking about the speech in your life. Let's start talking about your life in general. Are you setting an example for your family? Are you setting an example for your coworkers, for your neighbors? How well are you loving them? What are you doing in your faith? What are you modeling in your faith? And how's the purity in your life? So we see Paul saying to Timothy, train yourself to be godly, set an example. He's telling him to read Scripture, right? Devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture. Go out there and preach and teach. When he says, he ends this chapter by saying, don't neglect these gifts. So mentors, if we really want to simplify mentorship at its finest by looking at this example and this model of Paul and Timothy, a great mentor encourages his protege to train himself to be godly. He encourages him to set an example. He encourages him to read Scripture. He encourages him to preach and teach. And maybe your protege is not a full-time pastor, but guess what? He is the spiritual head of his home. And then finally, we have to always encourage and remind and say, don't neglect, but be diligent. Give it your all. And proteges, we have to respond to this. We have to respond to a mentor's encouragement. And we actually have to do what we say we're going to do. So guys, look at 1 Timothy chapter 4. Look at how Paul is saying to Timothy, train yourself to be godly. Set an example. Read Scripture, preach, and teach. And finally, whatever you do, do not neglect, but be diligent and give yourself to all of it. We'll talk to you guys next time.